up guys? So we're back here now for the last video that we're going to film about deloading, and basically what we want to look at now is exactly how you can implement deloads into your training program in like the simplest way possible. So the main training variables that we want to look at when we're going to reduce the overall training stress of our program, it's going to be volume first off, so obviously just the volume of workload that we do. So in this scenario, that is simply sets times reps. We're not looking at workload, which would be sets times reps times weight. We're looking at volume of work, so sets times reps, the total amount of reps that you perform in your training plan on a weekly basis. Okay, that is probably the training variable that has the biggest impact on your training stress. It's also a nice one to use when it comes to deloading because it tends to be very easy to adjust. You know that, say for example, you have 50 working sets in your training week and you want to bring in a 20% reduction to that, you simply drop down to 40 sets in your training week. It's a very simple bit of math that's easy to do on your training program on a spreadsheet or whatever like that. It tends to be a very approachable way for you to deload, that's easy to kind of comprehend, that also has a big effect. Now, intensity or intensiveness also has a very big impact on training stress. Maybe not quite as much as volume, but still very high. Now, when we're talking about intensity or intensiveness in this context, we're not talking about intensity as in the percentage of your 1 rep max, so the weight on the bar or whatever it might be. What we're talking about is how difficult that set is on, say, an RPE scale. Obviously, you can look at difficulty in several different ways. You've got reps and reserve RPE, various others, but let's just go with RPE for now because that's the one that most people tend to understand and use. When we look at intensiveness, we're looking at where that set that we did scores on that RPE scale. So obviously 10 would be the highest, obviously all the way down to 1, which we're not really going to use in a training program anyway, but that is what we're going to adjust when we're adjusting intensity or intensiveness. Does not necessarily mean that the weight that we're using has to change. It can simply mean that we reduce the intensity of the set, possibly by reducing the amount of reps that we have to do, or possibly by dropping any special methods that we're doing. So say, for example, we're doing 5 sets of 3 with like an 8-second eccentric on some strength movements. We could drop the 8-second eccentric and use the same weight. Therefore, we have decreased the intensiveness or the difficulty of that set without changing the weight that we're using or even the exercise that we're using either. So when we look at deloading, most of the time, those are the variables that we're going to be adjusting because those are the ones that are going to have the biggest impact on the load or the training load that we have on our stress. So we do have secondary factors that we can play with. Now, these tend to be useful when we just need to reduce training stress a little bit more, or if we just want to build in those kind of mini deloads that I spoke to you about in the previous video where we build them into our kind of block periodization scheme. Adjusting these can be just enough to drop the intensity a little bit as like a mini deload. So the first one that we can use here is exercise selection. So the more coordination, the more difficult a movement is to coordinate or perform, the more muscles that have to work together to perform it, generally speaking, the more strenuous or stressful that exercise is on our nervous system. So, you know, right at the top of that scale, we could have things like the full Olympic lifts that require the entire body to work together in an incredibly precise, coordinated fashion. Now, at the very bottom of that scale, we could have something like a machine bicep curl. So we've got a single joint movement, which we are almost completely stabilized for, and is moving on what is essentially a fixed path. So it's very little coordination to do in terms of muscle groups together because we're isolating a single muscle group, and we don't really even have to control where the weight is moving to a degree because it's already on a fixed path. So those are the kind of two extremes that we have in terms of exercise selection. Now, if we need to reduce our training stress a little bit, what we can do is step away from those big barbell movements that require a lot of coordination, and we can move towards things like machines and pulleys, or even just swapping out multi-joint movements for single joint or isolation exercises. That way we can perform the same volume of work at the same level of intensity, but it's going to be considerably less strenuous on the nervous system. Now, the last variable that we have to play with is rest periods. Now, this probably has the smallest effect on training stress overall, but it is worth mentioning. Now, If you are someone who is taking quite low rest periods in their training, maybe 60 seconds, 90 seconds, 2 minutes maybe at most, you have quite a lot of room to increase the rest periods that you're taking between your sets, and therefore decreasing the amount of adrenaline that your body has to release during that workout to achieve it. So if you're someone who is already using kind of 3, maybe 4 minute rest periods, take for example, if like you're primarily doing strength work, this isn't really a variable that you're going to be able to play around with much, because extending your rest periods past about 4 minutes is not really going to make the workout any less stressful. In fact, it can just end up hurting your performance, because you essentially begin to cool down and your nervous system activation drops down too much between your sets. But it is worth mentioning that if you're someone who's generally using shorter rest periods in their training, increasing your rest periods can just take the edge off the intensity and the stressfulness of your workout. So how you need to manipulate these pretty much is going to be determined by how fucked up you are. So what we've got here is the 3 stages of being fucked up. So level 1 would be just feeling a little bit off. So your performance probably hasn't dropped at this point. Day to day you kind of feel okay, but you're probably just feeling a little bit stiffer or more sore than usual, or maybe feeling like you need an extra coffee to get through your day, or maybe you need to use something like a pre-workout when normally you wouldn't, okay? This would be what we'd kind of class as level 1. What we're typically going to see here is that your beta receptors, as we mentioned earlier, which are the ones that bind to your adrenaline, have started to desensitize, which is now what you're feeling in terms of just feeling a little bit less motivated and a little bit less energetic. Hasn't quite got to the point yet where your performance is significantly dipped, but we're on the way to that. So if this is you, the easiest thing to do is to take one of these primary factors here, so volume or intensiveness, and drop that down by like 20 to 30% for 1 week. So if that's volume, obviously that's very easy to do. You could reduce the number of sets, which is the easiest way to do it. Or if you want to decrease the number of reps, you could also do that. But also then bear in mind that if you decrease the number of reps, not only are you decreasing volume, but you are also decreasing intensiveness if you keep the same weight. So just think about it, again, if just to use our generic 5x5 example, if I'm doing 5 sets of 5 at 100 kilograms and I want to deload, so I'm going to take 20% off my volume, I'm going to go down to 5 sets of 3. Now, if I do 5 sets of 3 at 100 kilograms, that's also easier per set than it was when I was doing 5 sets of 5. So not only am I doing 20% less volume, but now I'm also doing it at a weight that is less challenging. So essentially in that scenario, I have decreased volume and intensiveness. So if you do that, just be aware that if you don't want to affect the intensiveness of the workout, if you're dropping reps, then you will likely need to put the weight up a little bit to make sure that you can maintain the intensiveness so that you're only affecting one of those factors. Now, the other option that you have would be to just adjust both of these secondary factors. So in terms of exercise selection, then you're going to be looking at taking out most of the compound lifts in your program for a week, and also looking at increasing the rest periods that you're using. So again, that same example, so we've got 5 sets of 5 on something like a front squat, we would swap over to doing our 5 working sets on something like a leg press, for example. And if we're taking 2 to 3 minutes of rest in between our front squat sets, we might take 3 to 4 minutes of rest between our leg press sets. Very simple. That again is probably going to do a little bit less than reducing one of these factors, but again, it's there if you kind of want just a little bit of a deload. Now, if we've gotten towards level 2, so that's getting to the point now where we probably have seen a reduction in our performance in the gym. At this point, you're definitely going to feel like something is off and that you need a deload. Usually at this point as well, you may also be having some kind of brain fog or short-term memory issues, just like forgetting where you put your keys and all that type of thing. And obviously your performance is down in the gym. So if we're at this level, we need to just take a bit more of a step back so that we allow our body to recover and our nervous system to get back where we want it to in that 1 week period. Because all of this is going to be based on just taking a single week to get back to what we'd call our baseline. So if this is you, you have the option of bringing both of these factors down by 20 to 30%. So that would be reducing your work sets by 20 to 30%, or you could reduce your reps on everything and then also keep the weight the same, because then you've also brought the volume down and the intensiveness together. Now, the other option would simply be to keep the same volume, but bring your intensity down by 40 to 50%. So we can do this by just reducing one factor by 40 to 50%. So that basically means going from like an RPE 9 on all your work sets to something like an RPE 6. So every set in your week is basically going to be a warm-up set. Now, if you don't want to do that and you still want to train hard, instead you can just reduce volume by 40 to 50%. So again, that would look like if you have a 50 work set training week, we're going to be dropping down as low as 25, but keeping the intensitiveness level at the same. So within a week, that can be fine. Also, you can do it by reducing one of those factors, again, by 20 to 30% and adjusting these if you want to. So again, one of these plus these, or both of these by 20 to 30%, or just one of those by 40 to 50%. All of those are going to have pretty much the same outcome in terms of reducing the training stress. It simply depends what kind of resonates with you the best. If you're someone who likes to train intensely and likes to push their work sets very hard, then maybe you're better off than just reducing the volume and swapping over to these easier to recover from exercises, so that you can still push your machine chest press sets pretty hard, so you still feel like you've done a productive workout even though all the other variables have dropped down. Likewise, if you're someone who prefers to do a high volume of work because then you feel like you've achieved something, that's what you enjoy, then you do the polar opposite. You bring the intensiveness of the sets right down, and then you keep that volume up higher. Now, if you have managed to get yourself in a position where we're down here, level 3, then this is a scenario where you're probably simply going to have to take a week off the gym almost entirely. That doesn't mean that you have to be completely inactive. In fact, that's probably counterproductive. You still want to go out and walk. You could just swim, cycle, all that type of thing, but basically you want to avoid any form of strenuous training for a week entirely, or you need to drastically reduce your training intensity for 2 weeks. So basically what we've looked at for level 2, if we're at level 3, and then in this scenario, if we're at level 3, we're generally feeling pretty shit at this point. You're going to be in the scenario where you feel like you really have to drag yourself to the gym. It's going to take you a long time to warm up. Everything's going to feel stiff. All your movement patterns are going to feel off. You're going to know it if you're there. If this is you, you can treat yourself the same as being at level 2, but now you have to do it for at least 2 weeks rather than 1. So you have to take that heavily reduced training stress that we do at level 2, but do it for at least twice as long, and obviously then play it by ear based on when you feel like you're ready to go back to intense training. Now, in most scenarios, it tends to be easier to go with the first option of just taking 1 week entirely off, especially if you're a person who, again, enjoys training. And most of the time, you are going to be a person who is training hard and enjoying it. If you manage to get yourself to this point, it's going to be really hard for you to go into the gym for 2 weeks or maybe more and purposely do very little and put very little effort in. That's not going to be how you're wired. It's not going to be enjoyable. It's going to be a lot of effort. You're probably better off just taking that week completely out of the gym, because you're going to find it extremely difficult from like a willpower perspective, at least, to step foot in the gym and do the type of workout that you need to do to recover from. So these are the 4 main variables that you need to look at when you need to deload in your program. Again, which ones that you want to focus on are going to be determined on what you enjoy and what you like to push in your training more. But remember that how much you need to adjust them is going to depend on how fatigued you are at that point in time, and also how long you need to do them for.